The Grail is stone. There are many traditions that indicate that the Grail is a luminous stone that is intimately connected to the fall from grace and is some type of help and assistance in the quest for the Grail. Lucifer's brilliant green stone, that was the jewel of his crown, fell from heaven to earth and was fashioned into a bowl used by Jesus at the Last Supper. This stone became the Holy Grail after the blood of Jesus Christ had filled it. Lucifer's stone was redeemed by this act of Joseph of Arimathea, indicating that someday Lucifer himself may turn from darkness and reunite with the bright worlds of heaven surrounding the throne of God.
This image of the stone and the Grail is one of the most profound and yet least understood. What is being talked about is the stone is the mineral world, and that's the world that we have come to conquer. And in the original story, Lucifer is at the throne of God, which gives warmth and light and sound and life. And those are the ethers. But Lucifer wants much more than he can actually manage. And so he goes out and starts to gather up the darkness from the kingdom that is not being shed the warmth, light, sound, and life of the throne of God upon it. And he goes into the darkest corners of heaven and gathers up the most material, most crystalline, most physical substance that he can and compounds it into these stones that he makes into his crown that he wears. And the central stone, the green stone that is the stone that is the emerald stone that fell from the heavens and fell into the deepest place of the earth and was found by King Tyre and turned into a bowl and then given to Solomon, and then from Solomon went to Joseph of Arimathea. So this stone, what is it? It's a representation of what we are to do as we fall from grace and come into the material world, the world of crystalline form, and digest that form and return it back to its source. And that's what Lucifer is trying to do. Go back to the source from which he came, and yet have learned a great deal about the darkness of the mineral world that he had fallen into.
This stone was cherished by Adam and Eve and was passed down from father to son. The Sohar was described as a stone, but also as a bright window to heaven that brought light in the day and warmth at night. It was this Sohar that God told Noah to place in the ark to give light and sustenance to all humans and animals throughout the flood.
The pre-Christian mysteries of the Grail are quite profound, and the Jewish Hebrew mysteries of the Zohar, T-Z-O-H-A-R, prompted a book to be written called the Zohar, which has many of the legends that you'll hear that we talk about in relationship to the Grail. And the Zohar is a Hebrew tradition that is inexplicable because this stone has taken so many forms in the Hebrew legends that you can be mystified by it for the rest of your life if you try to understand the Zohar. On one hand, it's a window into the heavens. On the other hand, it's a window into the sun and the moon. On the other hand, it gives warmth. On another hand, it gives light. And ultimately, Noah took it into the ark, and it gave the nourishment that they needed. In other words, it was the original Hebrew Grail.
When Adam knew he was about to die, he sent his son Seth back to the Garden of Eden to find 3 seeds from the tree of life. Seth found the path back to Eden by following the footsteps of Adam and Eve, which were burnt into the stone they had walked upon. Seth was a highly developed soul who was pure of heart, therefore was able to convince the angel with the flaming sword to let him pass. Once Seth found the tree of life, he picked a fruit and found the 3 seeds he needed.
The traditions that address the question of the Stone of On, A-N, are also a Hebrew tradition and a legend that is utterly profound. The son of Adam and Eve goes back to the Garden of Eden, and you can see many different details of this story in different legends, but in one, this tree of life has intertwined with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it is only then that the fruit of those two trees, once they are mixed, gives this fruit that is needed, that Seth takes and the seeds from and puts into the mouth of his father who has died, Adam. And then that head, and some say in other legends, the whole body of Adam, but in some it's just the head of Adam, has these three seeds in it, and it is the Grail. It is the Zohar. It is the source of warmth, light, sound, and life that is the Grail of the Ark of Noah. And this is something that is so seldom ever addressed. And in the end, once Noah lands, he plants the head of Adam, and it grows into a tree. And that tree then becomes the very temple pillars of King Solomon's temple, and later become the two pieces of wood used as the holy cross upon which Jesus of Nazareth was crucified.
The Stone of Abraham is yet another version of the Holy Grail that insinuates that some type of shining stone is connected to the quest for the Holy Grail that brings the keeper of the Grail great powers of wisdom and healing.
The Stone of Abraham continues that tradition, so that the stone that was given by Azazel in the Garden of Eden to Adam and Eve, and they carried with them into the world, and it was their comfort, it was their warmth, their light, their sound, their life. It was their Grail. Later it was handed on to Abraham, and he wore it around his neck. And it was called the Stone of Zohar. And anyone who approached it could see the stone because he wore it for all to see, and it was the mark of the authentication of his own authority. So the nature of the Zohar is transformed over time with the Hebrew legends, and the Grail becomes much smaller and more personable, and goes from being the stone, headstone and the crown of Lucifer, into something that Abraham wore around his neck, dangling at his heart.
Alchemists also have their version of the Holy Grail as a stone they called the prime material, or the original substance of creation. Another name they give it is the Philosopher's Stone, which is purported to exist everywhere and nowhere, a substance that is transcendent.
That substance, once you study alchemy long enough, you find is the substance carbon. It's the substance that the entire organic natural world is based upon. And carbon is the most selfless of all substances. It gives up of itself to bond with anything else. And because of this characteristic of love, of giving, the very characteristic of the Holy Grail, all organic life comes into existence.
Once this stone is attained, the alchemist can then turn base metals into gold. It can also become the elixir of life, the heavenly dew, and the fountain of youth.
And this is why the quest for the Holy Grail has so many turns and so many levels and so many experiences, because the Grail quest is about ascension. It's about going back to where we came from, but doing it as awake human beings turning into angels. And the Grails along the way, because there are many Grails that we encounter, can help us on one stage or another. So whether we're studying alchemy, or whether we're studying Hebrew legends, or whether we're studying occult physiology and anatomy, it doesn't matter. Look for what the Grail has to teach you at any step along the way, and you'll find that the Grail transforms into whatever it is that you need.
Can these ideas be taken for face value, or are we to use a science of the Grail to understand the quest of the Grail? Is belief in the Holy Grail necessary to see the vision of the Grail that caused the seeker to the path? Or do we look for answers to these questions within our own physical body as a path of esoteric anatomy?
And this is the question. If you were one of King Arthur's knights around the round table and the Grail came floating into the room, some of them saw it, some didn't. Which would you be? Would you need to see it? Or would you still quest for the Grail knowing that others had seen it? These are matters that are the deepest concerns of the soul, seeking the spirit, the soul seeking the wings that it takes to arise into the spirit, to begin that path of Jacob's ladder, that path of ascension back to our home.
Pineal gland, fourth ventricle.
Is in fact, according to Rudolf Steiner, one of the physical representations of the Holy Grail in the human body. The pineal gland is the Grail, and it sits upon the Grail castle, which is the Corpus Quadrigemini, and it sits in the fourth ventricle. As it takes energy from the spine up through the cerebellum into the fourth ventricle and then into the third, and taking the gifts of the first and second ventricle, they offer this beautiful presentation of light, and it looks just like the description of the Holy Grail as it happens in the third ventricle. And that energy is then transferred to the pituitary gland and stimulates what is called the dew of heaven, or pituitrin in the pituitary gland, that causes the vascular and the nervous system to be rejuvenated.
The blinders of materialism may make the seeker unable to experience the grace and glory that exist right in front of him. We can see how the blindness of Longinus was healed by contact with divine blood and the love of a divine offering. The Holy Grail, like Christ's deed, is real, but the ability to witness them and understand their meaning is not given.
The pineal gland generally lies down and stops the flow of brain fluid into the third ventricle. But once there is enough electrical stimulation, in other words, once your eyes are opened and once the alchemical transformation from lead to gold happens from the energy that arises from the heart to the pineal gland and transforms carbon into carbon calcium carbonate, and also basically raises the pineal gland up so that there can be a flow of fluid from what are called the two rivers of the tree of life that happen at the cerebellum. There are also two other trees of life that happen in the first and second ventricle. And when all of them flow together, the human brain then becomes the Grail. And we, through our consciousness, become the questing Grail, passing through that castle to see if we can then master it and become the king or queen of the Grail castle.
We need not look any further than the human body if we wish to lift the blinders of materialism. Science has found miraculous wonders in every cell that show the Garden of Eden might be replicated in the DNA and the mitochondrial DNA in almost every cell.
Yes, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil seem to be quite clearly spelled out in every cell that has a nucleus in the human body. It also, according to some theorists, can be applied directly to DNA and the direct movement of the sun and its spiraling motion, which pulls the other planets behind it. When you look closely, you see that human anatomy, human physiology, tell the same stories as our greatest religious archetypes, as well as what we see happening when we look out into the cosmos.
Certain enzymes also take on miraculous characteristics and do not die, just transform and move at speeds that are incomprehensible. The open and awakened eyes and ears of the Grail seeker can see these wonders as miracles of the Grail of the human body.
Enzymes don't die unless they leave the human body. And when they're in the human body, they are like the Grail. They give out so much goodness to everything that can resonate with the key of that enzyme. And the enzyme doesn't die as it gives this life, this form, this manifestation, this warmth, light, sound, and life actually happens through the enzymes directly into the cells that need it at the exact moment that they need it. And the enzyme then doesn't die. It goes on to carry on, creating those transformations happening a million, a billion, a trillion times a second, beyond human comprehension. And that's what the Grail is. If it can happen in our cells, if it can epithelial cells, if it can happen in enzymes, if it can happen in all of the early characteristics of a human being of its first 3 years, the miraculous forces that are present there in the etheric body, those are the forces of the Grail. We need not look any further than a single cell of our human body to find that this is not an analogy, it is a reality.
Does the belief of the faithful change a relic so that it is more powerful over time because of the devotion of the faithful?
This is the question that has been addressed by so many spiritual teachers, the nature of elemental beings. Once consciousness is placed upon something, those elemental beings come into existence, and they have an existence of their own until the beings who created them either dissolve them or those beings continue on and metamorphose into whatever they can become based upon how much consciousness is given to them. So yes, every single relic that people believe in takes on a certain characteristic in this realm that adds the miraculous and the transcendent to the experience of what would be considered common and normal, but because they've been touched by the blood of Christ or by the saints or by those great beings who have reached up into heaven and come back to bring that news to us, those holy relics certainly do carry as much blessing as devotion has been poured into them.